this episode of Rings of Power, I think before we get too far into it, it was probably the strongest of the episodes other than maybe episode 2, and it's ironic because guess who was in both of those episodes predominantly? Elrond. If they just had the Elrond character in the show more, it would be working, I think, on so many more levels. And the relationship that the Elrond character, at least is how I'm looking at this purely from the show's perspective. Source material completely out the window for this. I have these like separate problems with the show and then the source material, any differences it might have from the source material, and any knowledge I have of the source material that makes me look at the show and like what it's doing in some kind of weird light. I'm kind of in a unique position to where I can completely detach those because after the first 2 episodes, I was kind of lost as to what was going on. I fault this on the show more than anything because I was in a position at the time where I did not know anything about the Second Age and the events of the source material in any capacity when this show launched. And I watched the first 2 episodes of this, and I kind of felt the same way. Like I got no information from what they showed me on screen to make me know what the hell was going on in the world at the time with any of the characters. Like I just didn't know. So sometime between it was either after the second episode or after the third episode. I think it was between the second and third episode because the show had done such a poor job, in all honesty, of just telling me what the hell was going on, what the characters' motivations were, and just everything. That's what a show needs to do. I just started to look into the source materials because I thought maybe I was missing something. Maybe this is all just right in my face and like I just don't know. I'm not familiar with the source material, so maybe it's my fault. So then I start looking into the source material. So thank you, Nerd of the Rings, for all your videos because I just plowed through a bunch of those. So now I feel like I know everything about the Second Age, First Age, what Tolkien wrote about the Third Age. Because now I know all the things that were different about the movie series, Peter Jackson's films, and the source material, and it's mind-blowing how different that was from the source material. So I'm looking at this show from like 2 perspectives. As a show, it really is failing in a lot of ways. Like all the characters are, some of the characters, not all the characters. And here's the thing too, to preface this, I don't want to sound like I'm shitting on the show, because I actually like and I enjoy watching the show. But there are some things like it's got some terrible pacing issues. It's got very, very, very underdeveloped characters. Some characters are just still 4 hours in unlikable in a lot of ways. So there's just like no character development. You don't understand the fundamental motivations of any characters in a lot of ways. Some more than others, for sure. Like I said, Elrond and Durin. Anytime Elrond and Durin are on screen, the show is singing. The show is fantastic when Elrond and Durin are doing their thing. They are great. Those characters since day one have been flushed out just through normal conversation between themselves, the interactions they had with each other, even the interactions that Elrond had with Gilgalad and Galadriel when they first meet each other. You knew everything you needed to know about Elrond, and that conversation with Elrond and Galadriel, all it did was make Galadriel look more like an asshole. Like he was all happy to like see her and like all this stuff, and then she shows up and doesn't want anything to do with him, doesn't give a shit about their friendship, and just says, "So you're going to get me this meeting with the king?" That's all she cared about. So it's just like all these things. Like, that's pretty much Galadriel's only through line this entire time. It's just been annoying, and that's how like a lot of the characters are. But it's just weird because, like I said, I'm in this unique position where I can look at it from the aspect of a show, and everything I just kind of said that was negative has nothing to do with any detract. Like I'm not bringing the source material into any of that. There's a whole other plethora of things now that I have, again, to quote myself, the gift of foresight. I have even more kind of issues with the show knowing what is supposed to happen, quote unquote. But my main issue, John, and I want to know if this is an issue with you, so I'll kick it over to you before I just keep ranting. The main issue I have with this show, and it kind of calls back what I said that you called out earlier, John, was that the show just inherently has been doing this cliffhanger thing for no reason. Right back to episode 1 or 2, whenever it was, with the Mithril. It was like the at the end of the episode, Durin and the King Durin, which that's a whole problem in and of itself. Like just to give you a little, just a flex on the Tolkien knowledge I now have, the dwarves only name their kings Durin when like if I'm remembering correctly, there's actually like a canonical issue with the fact that the Durin we were introduced to is named Durin because the king of the dwarves at the time is only supposed to be given the name Durin when they believe that he is the original Durin reincarnated into him. And that's what earns them the right of being named Durin the Fourth or whatever. But in the show, you have King Durin, who would just be Durin the Third, and now he's Durin the Fourth, presumably. So that's its own kind of like canonical mishap. But nevertheless, they do the thing at the end of that episode when the dwarves open the box and the Zelda music plays, like da na na na, and then they don't show you what's in the box. And everybody, like, knew, even our first guess, and this was pre me looking into anything and knowing anything at all about the Second Age, I just assumed it was mithril. Even my tame knowledge of the world was like, well, that's either mithril or it's a Silmaril. But it would make really no sense for it to have been a Silmaril because there's been no documentation that I'm aware of any dwarves in the Second Age have coming, especially Durin having a Silmaril in any way, shape, or form. But the fact that they made it glow when they opened the box in the end of that episode, and then in this episode, when Durin opens the box, it didn't glow. It's like another thing where it's like you could look into it more and be like, are they doing another cliffhanger thing to say that maybe King Durin in his special box, maybe he did have a Silmaril because it glue? Or did they just do that initial open the box and it glows for suspense, for a cliffhanger for no reason? Because ultimately, when he finally opened the box, it wasn't a surprise. We all knew it was going to be mithril. And then on top of that, the most inherent problem I have is that they seem to be setting everything up in that way to have this big M. Night Shyamalan twist. We still don't know who Sauron is or what Sauron is doing right now. And I think personally, that is a huge mistake. Like, I think Sauron should be interpreted more like Thanos. We should be following Sauron on this journey and seeing what he's doing, because then we would understand his motivations. We would see the interesting thing about the source material is not that Sauron tricked everybody. Like we all know that's going to happen. So that's where it comes back into the M. Night Shyamalan thing that they're going for really no reason. We all know it's Sauron. We all know watching this that Sauron is the bad guy. This is leading up to the War of the Ring. We all already know. So I think them hiding Sauron and making everybody sit here and second guess who Sauron is a huge waste of time, and it would be much more interesting, just like it is in the books, to actually see the exchanges of dialogue that Sauron has. When Sauron takes on the Anatar form and goes and visits the Elvish kingdoms, and he talks to Gil-galad and Elrond and Galadriel, and they're all skeptical of this Anatar figure, and they turn him away. They think he's up to some shit. They didn't like him. Like they were very weary and suspicious of him. So they send him away. And then when he leaves, he stops by Celebrimbar's place and he essentially uses the knowledge that he gained from his interactions with Galadriel and Elrond and Gil-galad, and then changed up his game and was able to convince Celebrimbar to make the goddamn rings. Seeing this stuff play out is what's interesting. Seeing Sauron going and actually being the master manipulator he is and how he's able to spread his influence. That's the interesting stuff. And it's annoying to me because like in the books, and I don't want to be like in the books guy. Like I'm just saying this is a fundamental the way they're telling the story because I was already lost while I was watching the show before I knew what was going on. But now that I know what's in the books, it's just annoying from a storytelling perspective because Tolkien didn't write it to be a M. Night Shyamalan twist. And again, we already know it's Sauron. So the fact that they're keeping Sauron in the dark and kind of taking influence, I imagine, from the Peter Jackson films, because I don't know if any of you knew this, but Sauron was never a big giant eye on the tower. Sauron very much had a physical form during the events of the Third Age. So that was a pretty heavy adaptation. It worked in the Peter Jackson films because he really didn't do a whole lot of boots on the ground stuff at that point in time. But that's not really the case in the second age. So it just really kind of annoys me because because it's fundamentally not really written in that fashion. It's not supposed to be a secret to the reader that Sauron is doing these things. As a reader, we know Sauron's doing this. We're following that stuff. We're understanding it. But in the show, we still don't even know who he is yet. It's like, is it Halbrand? Is it the stranger? But nevertheless, that's my biggest problem. It's just the way the way the characters have been perceived is not very good. They haven't done a good job of like explaining the plot. It's just a lot of little things like that. But this episode was, I think, the kind of the turning point for the series, and it needed to be because the last rant I'll have here before I kick it to you, John, is that all of this, on top of the fact that this has been the 4th hour of an 8-hour series. We are halfway through this series at this point. There are 8 episodes. In 4 hours, there is absolutely no excuse for you to not have given the audience a clear understanding of your characters, their motivations, the plot, the narrative, all these things. The first movie, Fellowship of the Ring, is 2 hours and 58 minutes long. Most movies are 90 minutes to 120 minutes. So even at the time of the 3rd episode, 3 hours into this series, you had twice as much time as a 90-minute movie, and 2/3 of that time is an hour and 20-minute movie. And there's no excuse for anybody to be lost, uninterested, your characters to not be flushed out in any way, shape, or form. There's just no excuse. In a 90-minute movie, people are able to tell a beginning, middle, and end. You understand character motivations, etc. That's my biggest problem. John, what do you have before I just keep going on with this?
Yeah, see, I'm not as heavily invested in it as you are now. Like you have that all this wealth of extra knowledge. I thought it was good. They are setting up these kind of random cliffhangers just for the sake of having them. And the one thing I'll say about the cliffhangers is I don't care. Cliffhangers only work if you really care, I think.
No,
And they also don't make a lot of sense to me. Like you said, there seems to be this mystery around who Sauron is. So unless it's going to be a wholly new character to me. Well, I guess it could be the guy that was in the Meteor that we've had a total of like 50 seconds of screen time that has kind of grunted his way through his scenes and
mhm,
really I don't give two craps about at this
yeah.
point. Like that whole aspect of the show is very confusing me. Like I never would have thought in a Lord of the Rings show I would have seen a human fall from space and land. So
Well,
unless
and
there's
be
some sort of
bored by it.
and be bored by it, yeah.
That's the stranger
Just
part, no pun
just be
intended.
confused, yeah, just be confused by it.
Well, see,
So
with
and
The
let
Stranger, it's interesting because that obviously didn't happen in the books. The Harfoots aren't in the Second Age. So the predominant theory that I buy into is that, and this is the easiest explanation for people who are only familiar with the movies as well, like 99% of people are, is that that would be Gandalf. Even though Gandalf isn't supposed to be here for another 1,000 years, he doesn't show up in Middle Earth till the Third Age. But the fact that you have the Harfoots in the Second Age as well, who are not supposed to be here, and then you have this guy crash from the sky, making that Gandalf would explain why Gandalf has this affinity towards hobbits later in the Third Age.
sure.
So, like, that's the only thing that actually makes sense for either of those characters to be put together right now, because if it's not Gandalf, it doesn't make any sense for him to have had to landed by the Harfoots. Why else are you shoehorning in the Harfoots? Because they're not even supposed to be here right now. If you needed someone to fall from the sky, they could have landed to anybody. So it's like, yeah, it should be a blue mage if you're going by the books, but I don't really expect this to do everything by the book. And so just trying to piece things together now that I do know the books, it's like, well, that's really the only person it could be. And it also makes sense for people who aren't familiar with the books for it to be Gandalf. But I
Yeah.
don't know. Could be whoever.
And if it's Sauron, like
It makes
that's
less
gonna
sense
make
too.
it makes less sense, but it's also gonna make Sauron this kind of really this guy that like why? Why would Sauron fall from the sky and why would he be this weak, bumbling idiot at this point. Like it just, and plus we got that shot early on in the series of Sauron in front of his army in his armor and kind of in silhouette. So
Looking cool as
I've always assumed that Sauron was just out there doing his thing. I never thought that we'd actually that one of our characters could possibly, I still don't think that any one of our characters could possibly be Sauron, which means that once they introduce Sauron, he's kind of been kept off the board for no reason at this point. Like it's
Mhm.
just being done for the sake of being done. Maybe there's the thought that he's more ominous as this presence and not actually being involved in the show, but that hasn't quite worked out that way. It hasn't worked out that way for me, at least. Um,
And
so yeah,
that
that
goes to, like, what I was saying was my problem with the show as someone approaching the show initially with no knowledge, and now with that knowledge, Sauron is very active in this time period. Like, he shapeshifts into an elf-like figure and goes and tries to manipulate Galadriel Gilgalad, which is the king of the elves that they were talking to when she got sent to the west initially, and Elrond, and they're all skeptical of him at that time. And then after that situation happens, he goes down to Celebrimbor, who is trying to build that forge. And he's the person who crafts the rings because Sauron convinces him to do so. So the way the show has been set up, why else would he be making a forge other than to make the rings? So that makes me think that Sauron has already visited Celebrimbor and convinced him to build the forge and make these rings. And if that's the case, why was any of this off screen? Like, it's like that's the interesting stuff, in my opinion. It's like Thanos. We saw everything he did, and it was interesting because we understood where he was coming from. He's an interesting character. But, like, they're just completely throwing that out the window, it seems like, in this case, because we haven't been introduced to him in any way, shape, or form. And like you said, after the first 2 episodes, it's like this cliffhanger stuff for the sake of having a cliffhanger. It's like they want us all to think XYZ person is Sauron.
yeah.
Just so we're they're keeping us guessing for no reason. Just so they can have this false M. Night Shyamalan twist when the time comes. But the problem is, like you said, you have to care when a twist happens. Like, when we found out that it was Mithril in the chest, no one fucking cared because it's not a surprise. We knew it. It's like the Agatha song, like, it was Agatha all al like, that's what they're doing, like, it's like, "Oh, they want it to be like it's Sauron all along," and, like, we fucking know it's Sauron. Why don't you just show us what's happening so we better understand the story? I literally feel like Thanos because, like, I'm burdened with this knowledge of knowing where it's all going now or where it's, like, quote, unquote, "supposed to be going" and whatever, and that makes the viewing experience honestly kind of it's not necessarily worse, but it's a little bit more frustrating, more so than anything, because before I knew what was supposed to have been going on during this time period in the source material, I was just lost as a viewer because the show had a very bad pace. You didn't really understand the character motivations. You didn't understand where any of these plot lines were going. And I argue you still don't. Like, really. Like, I don't know, do you think you have a good idea of where the story's going as someone who hasn't read the books and stuff and know anything about it?
No, I have no idea. I don't even know how these characters are ever going to come together and like interact. We're watching multiple different storylines, and I don't ever see how they're all going to converge. I mean, not that I need to see, but I don't know. I don't
Well, that's the
know.
thing,
It's
you don't need to understand everything, but I actually thought about that exact thing earlier. I was literally sitting here as I was ranting in my own head about making this video. With everything they've done from a show standpoint, we have no idea how any of this connects whatsoever. And after 4 hours, nobody should be lost, should be confused about any of the characters and what they're needing to do, what their motivations are. After the first episode of House of the Dragon, they introduce you to every single character. You know exactly what they're going to do for the rest of the season, pretty much. You don't have to know anything about the books, and you fundamentally know everything that those characters are going to do. Not to sit here and compare one show to the other by any means at all. I have a video that says stop comparing the two. That video was more or less about comparing the two as fantasy stories, right? As shows, it's perfectly appropriate to compare them Like, is if you're keeping the source material completely removed and you just wanna say like, "Well, this show's doing a lot better job of explaining what the characters are doing. I'm able to follow this show more than I'm able to follow that show," especially if you're completely detached from the source material. I think that's a perfectly apt comparison at that point. You can compare. It's funny, John, I just responded to a comment on one of the, I think it was the Stop Comparing, the 2 shows video, and I think it's funny because obviously the easy comparison to go to is House of the Dragon versus Lord of the Rings because they're both fantasy shows and they're
Sure,
both playing right now. But
sure.
in all actuality, House of the Dragon has more in common with Succession on HBO. Both of the shows are about succession. And you could this is something that kinda lends itself to being, like, good storytelling despite the setting. Because I always say that, like, Game of Thrones is essentially like a political drama or a political thriller set in a fantasy world. So you have these fantasy elements, you have a fantasy setting, but the core part of the Game of Thrones story is this political drama and interpersonal character dynamics, and that's it. The show really focuses on characters and then the political stuff and the machinations within. And you could literally take the Game of Thrones or the House of the Dragon story and you could just drop it into modern day, like the show Succession, and it works. You could put Succession and just yank all those characters and throw them into the House of the Dragon. It works. Like, yeah, you have to change some things. They're not working at a fucking multi-million dollar modern company, but the basic premise of the show and what it's actually about, the succession, works in any medium. This show, Rings of Power, it doesn't work in any medium right now, really, on its own. There's not enough information. The plot hasn't been executed very well. The characters haven't been fully flushed out. You could not pull any characters out of this show and put them in another show and say it would work because we don't even know what the real narrative is yet still. And I think the most egregious thing here is that after 4 hours of my life, we still don't know what's going on and I don't really care about all the characters, right? Like I said, most movies are 90 minutes long and they do everything that this show has had more than enough time to do, and they tell their full beginning, middle, and end in half the time of the first 3 episodes if you're going at 90 minutes. And like
Uh-huh.
I said, Peter Jackson was able to do it with Fellowship of the Ring, so that's probably the most accurate comparison you could have, right? You compare the first 3 episodes of this show versus Fellowship of the Ring. They both had the same job to do in 3 hours or less. They had to introduce you to the world of Tolkien and Middle-earth. They had to introduce you to all the races and the characters and what their motivations are, tell you what the overall narrative, what the arc was for the whole all 3 movies, let alone just the first movie that you're watching. It show you the inner character dynamics, all this stuff. They had to do all that, and since this was a movie, they had to tell a complete beginning, middle, and end. And Peter Jackson was able to do that. You understood everything you need to know about the world of Tolkien just by watch at least Peter Jackson's interpretation of Tolkien, just by watching Fellowship of the Ring. You weren't lost. You understood everything. You knew what was going on. So the first and that movie was only 2 hours and 58 minutes long. The first 3 episodes of this, longer than that, and it didn't accomplish any of that. Like, just period. It just didn't. All that said, though, I like the show, and it has so much fucking potential. I'm just kind of baffled. Like, because I'm like, when I didn't know anything, I thought I was just stupid and didn't know the source material and I was lost. So then I research all this stuff and I do my own homework and now I know everything about it and from a lore perspective. And now I just have this whole other sense of aggravation because it's like, well, it wasn't me. It's just like they're just not telling the story properly, and not based on the source material, just as a show. Like there's no excuse for you to be like as lost as you are. Like it's just crazy. If you like this clip and want to be a part of the conversation, come back and join us for our live House of the Dragon after shows every Sunday around 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time and 7:30 p.m. Pacific Time, immediately following the premiere of each episode on HBO Max. We're also doing live after shows and Q&As every Friday around 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time with a 6:30 p.m. Pacific Time for She-Hulk, Lord of the Rings of Power, and we'll also be doing one for the Star Wars prequel series Andor when that comes out later this month. So if you like those shows, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you'll get notified every time that we go live. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the chat and answering your questions in our next video or live stream. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like the video and let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below, and we'll see you in the next one. Like and subscribe.